Sergeant Emma Harris stood at the entrance of the bustling airport terminal, her fingers wrapped tightly around her boarding pass. Her heart ached from the strain of 6 long months spent overseas. The weight of the past few months, filled with danger and sacrifice, pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had lived through it all. Amidst the blistering heat of the desert and the constant threat of attack, she had kept her focus on the mission, and now, finally, she was heading home. A brief but warm smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she imagined the comforting embrace of her family. As she moved through the crowds of travelers, she could hear the familiar sounds of the airport, the clinking of luggage wheels, the murmur of conversations, the hurried footsteps of those eager to reach their gates. The announcement crackled over the intercom, calling for passengers boarding flight 1285 to New York. Emma double-checked her ticket. First class. She blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected such a luxury, but it seemed that someone had made a mistake, or perhaps there had been an upgrade. She wasn't about to question it. Her military-issued boots clicked firmly against the floor as she walked toward the gate. She had always known that her service to the country would take her to difficult places, but never had she imagined being so far from home for so long. And now, after all that time, she was finally heading back. The feeling was almost surreal. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her small bag as she made her way toward the plane. Boarding the aircraft, Emma was greeted warmly by the flight attendant. "Welcome aboard, ma'am. Your seat is 1A right this way." Emma nodded in thanks, a sense of comfort settling over her. She had been through so much, and the idea of returning to her family was the only thing that had kept her going through the toughest days. She stowed her bag in the overhead compartment and sank into the plush seat, allowing herself a moment to relax. The extra legroom felt luxurious compared to the cramped military transports she had become accustomed to. As the plane began to fill with passengers, Emma closed her eyes, her mind drifting toward thoughts of home. Just then, a sharp voice sliced through the tranquility. "Excuse me, I believe you're sitting in my seat." Emma's eyes snapped open, startled. A man well-dressed and in his mid-50s stood in the aisle. His eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down, lingering on her military uniform with an expression of disdain. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is my assigned seat," Emma replied, trying to maintain a professional tone. She handed him her boarding pass, hoping to avoid any further confrontation. The man scoffed. "There must be some mistake. This is first class. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Emma's stomach twisted uncomfortably. She had dealt with prejudice before, but this felt different. It was a reminder of how far she had come, only to be judged for something she couldn't control. She had been prepared for the dangers of war, but the cruelty of this moment felt far more personal. "I assure you, sir," Emma said calmly, "I have been assigned to seat 1A. She handed him her boarding pass again, her hands steady. He snatched the ticket from her, scrutinizing it with a furrowed brow. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "I paid a premium for this seat. Surely there's been some mix-up." At that moment, a flight attendant approached, her voice polite but firm. "Is there a problem here, sir?" The man turned to her, his voice rising in anger. "This woman claims to have a first-class ticket. It doesn't make any sense." The flight attendant looked at Emma's boarding pass, and then back at the man. "Everything appears to be in order, sir. Sergeant Harris is indeed assigned to seat 1A. The man's face turned a deep shade of red. "This is unacceptable," he spat. "I paid for this seat. I won't tolerate this." The flight attendant remained calm. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. Sergeant Harris has a valid ticket, and she has every right to be in that seat. Please take your seat so we can prepare for takeoff." The man shot Emma one last glare before grumbling and stomping off to his own seat. Emma took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. The flight attendant turned to Emma, her expression softening. "I'm really sorry about that, Sergeant. Is there anything I can do for you before we take off?" Emma smiled weakly, shaking her head. "No, thank you. I'm fine." As the plane taxied down the runway, Emma gazed out the window, her mind replaying the events of the confrontation. She had faced death countless times in Afghanistan, yet this interaction over something so trivial left her feeling more shaken than any firefight. The hum of the engines filled her ears as the plane lifted into the sky, the world below shrinking into a patchwork of city streets. She thought about her family waiting for her back home, and about the man who had challenged her place on the flight. As the fasten seatbelt sign turned off, Emma reached for her backpack and pulled out a small notebook and a pen. Maybe, just maybe, she could turn this ugly situation into something meaningful. She began to write, her pen moving swiftly across the page. "Dear Sir," she wrote, pausing for a moment to consider her words. This wasn't about anger or retribution. It was about understanding, about bridging the gap that had formed in a moment of judgment. She began to explain who she was, her experiences in Afghanistan, her service to her country, and how the confrontation had made her feel. As she wrote, Emma didn't notice the man from earlier watching her from across the aisle. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even a hint of regret. The flight attendant came by again, this time with a gentle smile. "Sergeant Harris," she said softly, "I couldn't help but notice you're writing something. May I ask what it is?" Emma looked up, surprised by the interruption. She hesitated before answering. "It's a letter to the gentleman who questioned my seat earlier. I thought maybe if I shared a little about my story, it might help him understand." The flight attendant's eyebrows raised in surprise. "A letter? That's certainly unexpected. May I ask why?" Emma glanced down at the notebook, then back up at the flight attendant. "I believe there's always room for understanding, even in difficult situations. I thought maybe if I shared a bit of my story, it might help him see things differently." "That's incredibly thoughtful of you, Sergeant," the flight attendant said, her voice warm with admiration. "Would you mind sharing a bit of what you've written?" Emma hesitated but then nodded. She began to read the letter aloud, describing the bond she had formed with her fellow soldiers in Afghanistan, how they had come from all walks of life, yet had become a family through their shared experiences. As she spoke, the plane hit a patch of turbulence and the seatbelt sign flashed on. The flight attendant quickly excused herself to check on other passengers. Emma tucked her notebook away, promising herself she would finish the letter once things had settled down. The turbulence grew more intense, and the plane shook. Passengers around her clutched the armrests, their murmurs filling the cabin. Emma, however, remained calm, her military training kicking in. She noticed an elderly woman across the aisle, her face pale with fear. Emma leaned over and spoke gently. "It's okay, ma'am. This is normal. Just take deep breaths." The woman nodded, her hands trembling as she gripped her seat. Emma continued to offer quiet words of reassurance, not just to the woman, but to others around her who seemed anxious. As the turbulence finally subsided and the plane steadied, Emma glanced across the aisle. The man who had confronted her earlier was watching her with a mix of surprise and respect. She offered him a small nod, acknowledging the unspoken shift in the air. She returned to her notebook, continuing to write the letter. Her pen moved quickly as she poured her heart onto the page. She wrote about her experiences in Afghanistan, the hardships, the camaraderie, and the lessons she had learned about humanity and resilience. She wanted to help the man understand that the uniform she wore didn't just represent her service. It represented the sacrifices of countless others. When the drink cart arrived, Emma ordered water, then went back to writing. She described the pride she felt wearing her uniform, not just for herself, but for all the men and women who had served before her. Hours passed, and before she knew it, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom announcing their descent into New York. Emma finished her letter, signed her name, and slipped the pages into an envelope. She tucked it away in her bag, her heart lighter than it had been when she boarded the plane. As the plane touched down smoothly and passengers began to disembark, Emma stood up, her duffel bag heavy in her hand. She made her way down the aisle, feeling the weight of the envelope in her pocket. She spotted the man just ahead, pulling his carry-on from the overhead compartment. She approached him, her heart racing. "Excuse me, sir," Emma said, her voice steady. "I wanted to give you this." She handed him the envelope. The man hesitated, looking at her with confusion. "What is it?" he asked. "It's a letter," Emma explained. "I thought it might help explain some things. You don't have to read it now, but I hope you will when you have a moment." The man stared at the envelope for a moment before reaching out slowly to take it. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer now, less defensive. As passengers began to file off the plane, Emma watched the man from the corner of her eye. He cleared his throat before speaking again, his voice low. "Sergeant Harris, I think I owe you an apology." Emma raised an eyebrow, surprised by the shift in his tone. "Sir, I was wrong," the man said, avoiding her gaze. "I made assumptions that I shouldn't have." Emma nodded, acknowledging his apology. "Thank you for saying that. It takes courage to admit when we've made a mistake." The man finally looked at her, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. I lost my brother in Afghanistan 2 years ago. He was a soldier too, he added quietly. The words hung in the air, and Emma felt a strange sense of understanding between them. She had been prepared for the loss of her comrades, but hearing the man's pain, his grief, bridged the gap that had existed just moments before. As they moved toward the exit, the man turned to Emma one last time. "Welcome home," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emma's throat tightened as she stepped off the plane. The unexpected turn of events had left her with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. This was the beginning of something far more important than she could have imagined. As she walked through the airport, she felt the weight of the day's events settle over her. Compassion, understanding, and courage had paved the way for change. And in that moment, she knew she had found her next mission, building bridges, one conversation at a time.